Whoa, it's January. I hate January. Right in first foremost, Gran Turismo 1, B tier. Now, don't be mad. I know all the nostalgia rose-tinted F-boys are going to be super mad at the fact that I just gave the precious greatest game of all time a B tier. This is the lowest entry on the list, and that's a good thing. The fact that I can say that the first game is the lowest ranked game means that every other game, all the successors, have succeeded in their job at being better than their predecessor. Do you know how many companies can't do that, where they make sequels to things and it actually becomes worse the further they go along? So yes, this is a B tier. Take off your rose-tinted goggles. I'm going to be grading all the games at the time of release, and even at the time of release, this game was just above average. You know, it was a cut above the rest, but it wasn't something to just write home about. It wasn't the greatest game in the world. Gran Turismo 1 lacked content. That's its greatest weakness. It only had like 11 tracks, it only had a few cars, and on top of that, it didn't have much to do on the overworld, and it also really didn't have that many events. Overall, you know, I would still say it's a solid game if you revisit it knowing that you're just honoring the fact that it is the first of the franchise. Because of that, it's the most bare bones, which I don't blame it for. They're dipping their toes in the water, they were experimenting with what they should and shouldn't do. The fact that the first game is the worst makes me so happy, so B tier. Gran Turismo 2, on the other hand, it's S tier. This game was way too ahead of its time, so it did everything Gran Turismo 1 did, and then cranked it probably times 10, like not even times 2 or 4. This thing was over the top. There were over 600 cars, and half of those cars had liveries, and you could add spoilers, and you can racing modify them, and you could just race them essentially and kind of dick around with it. But I love that. I love that a PS1 game gave you those options. Graphically, I actually liked it. To this day, I still think its graphics are charming as hell. It has this weird, perfect, like just nostalgic PS1 vibe. When it came to the actual campaign mode, how much content there was a lot of things to do, and I liked the way it went about progression. A lot of the content was locked about having certain cars, and I like the fact that it challenges you. When 100%ing this game, you actually have to be really careful of how you spend your money and what cars to build and how many cars to buy and when to sell cars when you've done every event that was possible available for it, so you can make room to buy another car for another event. It also had almost 50 tracks to play around with, and also even had some secret tracks that you can unlock via the licenses and simulation mode, and then you can revisit them back in arcade mode, so you would swap disc out. That is how much content this game had. It needed 2 discs for it, and that's like such a PS1 era thing. Like, I believe by the time you got to PS2, it was rare for you to see games of 2 discs. You still would, but usually it'd be like a Final Fantasy game, but usually most games became 1 disc. Just kind of that throwback, that retro vibe, and just the fact that it was the pinnacle of everything you expected of the PS1 generation. It did everything it was told to do, everything we expected it to do, but then some. I can still get lost for hours playing it. I've done really cool challenges like trying to beat the game without even losing, and by losing I mean not even getting second place, and it is possible to do that challenge in many kinds of ways. There's just so many ways you can come back, revisit, tackle this game several years. You'll find cars that you haven't even raced out yet that you haven't put racing liveries on, and then you'll look back and you're like, I can't believe they let you do this, but part of you is like, I'm so glad they do at the same time. There was so much freedom to this game, so many ways you could play. I'm just gonna stop talking about it before it becomes the entire freaking video. If you're interested in watching me play Gran Turismo 2 or 3 and trying to beat both of those games without losing, otherwise I'll delete my save, tell me below, because that's actually a video I want to make. Now, moving on to its successor, Gran Turismo 3 suffered from a lot of things that brand new PS2 releases did. So when Sony made the PlayStation 2, obviously they rushed a lot of the game developers to push out a product, because they're like, hey, we're releasing a new console, you guys have to make a game, so at release people want this console, because no one's gonna buy a console that doesn't have any games to play on. Unfortunately, this did result in most game companies rushing the content, and on top of that, a lot of these game companies prioritized most of their content making for graphics instead, because again, it's more of a tech showcase. Like, it's like, hey, it's a brand new generation, let's show off the graphics. So graphically speaking, Gran Turismo 3, beautiful, and not just by the time of release standards. Even today when I boot up the game, I still think it's fantastic. Get an emulator, run it on 2K, it blows you away still, with one exception: the backdrops and the skyboxes. They don't look very good in high resolution, because in lower resolution they're kind of like clouded and far away, so you don't really notice the wonkiness of them. But once they're in high resolution, you kind of look at how blurry they are and you're like, wow, that skybox looks crap. But that's the only graphical thing that didn't age well. Like, the cars look fantastic, the racetracks look even better, like Deep Forest Raceway or Trial Mountain. Wow, like, it's still just stunning. It's beautiful. I love it. So Gran Turismo 3 graphically, it did its job. It was the tech demo. It was the one that said, hey, here's the PlayStation 2. Here's its capabilities. For that, I have to respect it. But it's not an SS tier, and unfortunately it's not even an S tier, it's an A tier, and the reason is because it's held back by the fact that it only looks good. When it came to cars, it's a huge step back. We're talking about way less content, like around 130 cars in the dealership, and the other 70-ish or so you unlock through events. Compared to Gran Turismo 2's 600 and plus, you know, that's a small number. And compared to Gran Turismo 2's track amount, it has also been reduced. It only had around 30-ish tracks in Gran Turismo 3, and again, that's just, you know, it's heartbreaking as a kid when I grew up playing the predecessor and noticeably seeing that the successor had taken steps back. Like, that hurts you, man. I know other kids may not have standards, but when I was a 6-year-old, I had standards. I was really sad to see some of my tracks in Gran Turismo 2, like High Speed Ring, not just be in GT3. I was like, come on, you could have just transferred the assets over. It can't have been that hard. Like, even little kid me kind of knew that. Like, just graphically update it. If anything, it'd be easier to transfer tracks that are already made. And the campaign mode was a lot easier than Gran Turismo 2 because a lot of the events weren't locked behind specific cars anymore. There were still some, but not enough. And that bothers me because if you knew how to speedrun Gran Turismo 3 after just 2 playthroughs or even 1 playthrough, you would know which events give which cars. And there's some events that give cars way too easily. The first event that little kid me always does is I don't even do events. I go to licenses, I get the IA license. Once you get the IA, you do the Super Speedway Endurance race. You can beat this race with a stock Corvette Z06. In fact, that car actually starts lapping people because I believe it beats with like a 20 lap margin. If you really want, you can use the turbo Miata, like a starter car. You can buy a Miata, then turbo it, and then put slick tires on it, and then only change your tires once every 12 laps. And you will win this event. And when you win the event, you will get a Formula car. And when you get a Formula car, you will beat the entire game in like 3 days, which unfortunately is what 6-year-old me ended up doing. And he didn't do that on intention, believe it or not. That was actually my first playthrough. I didn't look up a guide. I didn't look up friends who played it. I just saw Herder Super Speedway Endurance Race. You just make a left turn for 100 laps. That must be easy. Because I came from Gran Turismo 2, so you have to remember I wasn't totally inexperienced. I'd played a previous title. I knew where to get certain. I knew how to do endurance races. I knew how to do licenses. The first thing I learned from Gran Turismo 2 is that you should always grind out the licenses first before you even play the game. Basically, I used to like only get licenses when events rejected me, but after like my 4th playthrough of Gran Turismo 2, I caught into the fact that it's just easier that each new save just knock out all the licenses. When I carried that knowledge over to Gran Turismo 3, I accidentally did this. I ended up getting the Formula car, the F090S. I still remember it. I even remember the exact color scheme. I got the red and white one. And I just beat the whole game because not enough events limit the type of car you can choose. I think the first few events like the Sunday Cup or like the Club Cup, I'm showing up in an F1 car. These mofos have freaking Mini Coopers and I felt terrible for them. And even like when it starts going like the NA Cup or like the European Cup or American Cup or like Larry the Gamer have the Gran Turismo World League or whatnot, it doesn't limit your cars enough. Even when people are showing up in LM cars, I'm smoking them. When they're showing up in race cars, I'm smoking them. You know, I wish those events say must use race car, you know, must use an S-Class car, or must use LM cars. It was tragic. It was tragic that it wasn't like Gran Turismo 2 where they really limited the qualifications. I love that. I love that it's like, hey, 290 horsepower limit, come with a compact car, stop freaking, you can't just show up in a freaking F1 car. The only enjoyment I had from Gran Turismo 3 was from Super GT, because it was where I kind of got my ego checked when I realized that the AI were loading in with Formula cars. That was the most liberating feeling ever, was to finally meet my match and lose. And that's what made me kind of put my gamer mode on and get super excited. But it's tragic. It's tragic that the content was less, there was less cars, there was less tracks, but the difficulty of this game overall is just not as well done as Gran Turismo 2. The fact that you can cheese it all the way to the end game in less than a day, like now I can do it probably within 4 hours. I can get a freaking F1 car and then just start beating the Gran Turismo World Leagues and whatnot. And that is why I'm just going to give it an A tier. It's a memorable game. I had a lot of fun replaying it. Now let's talk about its successor. Gran Turismo 4, once again, this is an SS tier game. This is the only other SS tier on this list because if I throw that rating too much, it doesn't have meaning anymore. This is what GT2 was to the PS1, but for the PS2. Gran Turismo 4 was the pinnacle of the PlayStation 2, not just for racing games, but all PlayStation 2 games. This is a game that is the epitome of pre-DLC content. Ever since DLC became a thing, companies got smart where they're like, hey, we only need to work our employees 1 year, have them make like half the content, and then cut that further in half, and then put the other half that we didn't release behind a DLC paywall. Because while the game has been released, the employees are still working on the other stuff to develop. Gran Turismo 4, you could tell they didn't cut corners like that. This was back when games were still sold as a full, complete product. So there was just 3 years of just people cramming, doing everything they could, touching up every single detail, and giving you 100% of the game at release. This game had over 600 cars, it had over 100 tracks, it had the best campaign mode at its time of release because it finally took all the issues of Gran Turismo 3 and all the pluses of Gran Turismo 2 and even added some new ideas. Finally, it started to restrict more events. It also brought back horsepower restrictions for certain events, so you can't just unlock the F1 cars and clap competition, since events started to finally take advantage of my favorite feature in GT2, which is starting to add those restrictions, because it feels more down to earth and more simulation-like. You know, when you show up to these club events, like especially in real life, if I go to Miata Autocross Day and I show up my Corvette Z06, I'm a douchebag, alright? That's not fair, that's stupid. There's so much content in this game that you still can't even explore all of it, even given, you know, a few years to play it. You'll always find another way to replay it and revisit it. You'll always find some cars that you never thought about using before, and you'll find ways to modify it and like it. Graphically, this game wasn't just impressive to look at, it also added just life. Like, it was really cool that while you're rallying, people will be snapping photos of you, they'll be running and dodging you whenever you accidentally slam into the wall. It feels like things react to you, that there's life. You don't just see the still images that Gran Turismo 3 was. It didn't just make a pretty world, it made a world filled with life while also looking pretty. Gran Turismo 5 Prologue. This game will be the second lowest, and you know what, I take that back, it is going to be tied with the lowest ranking game. This is a B tier, because once again, this suffers from the issue Gran Turismo 3 did. It was more of a tech demo, but even lazier. Gran Turismo 3, whether I want to hate it or not, actually I don't hate it at all, I still gave it an A tier. Guys, that's a great rating. This is much happier than the Need for Speed video I made, so to anyone who's complaining or whining, just go watch the Need for Speed video and realize that I'm being really nice to Gran Turismo games, because at the end of the day, GT3 was still a completed game that had a lot of content still. You know, it kept childhood me entertained for about half a year, 6 months, that's pretty good. Prologue on the other hand, not a full game, and I know someone's gonna roll their eyes like, Bladed, it's a prologue, it's not supposed to be a full game. Keep in mind, this was $60 at release, and also, keep in mind, I'm judging these games based on their time of release, compared to all the other games and how much of a bargain they are. I did the same thing for the Need for Speed list, I'll do the same thing here. I don't want to be unfair, this is a B, because compared to all the other games that came out at the time for the PlayStation 3, this was the worst way to spend your money, essentially. No disrespect to the developers, I can understand that they probably made this game to fund the full Gran Turismo 5, but also because, let's be real again, Sony probably rushed them and was like, hey, we need a game to showcase at launch. As for the full completed version of Gran Turismo 5, S tier. This version of Gran Turismo 5, once again, fantastic game. I loved it graphically, I love the menu, I love just everything. It felt so cool. You start up the game, you see your car in those beautiful backgrounds. I still remember the one where it's like the cherry blossoms, and there's also the one where your car is like underneath a cliff and it's like a cave formation. I just still get chills thinking about it. The soundtrack for it, the story mode, or campaign mode rather, I loved it, and it brought back the amount of restrictions it did. I love the used car. I always love used cars. I always love the addition of that. I liked how it interacted with online players. You could do events that were online specific only that required internet connections. Given those events did pay out way too freaking much, where you could get like a McLaren F1 GTR after just a few times in those events. But it was my first Gran Turismo game where I had extensive online experience playing with other players. That gave me golden memories. So once it was a completed game, it had more content than Gran Turismo 4, it had more cars, it had about the same amount of tracks, and it had, you know, graphically speaking, it was still very stunning. Obviously didn't degrade from the prologue there, so it carried everything the prologue did, but it went up and beyond it. It brought back that Gran Turismo consistent quality that we expected, and that's why I love Polyphony Digital compared to a lot of other companies that make games, because they don't try to cut corners. And when they do, it still isn't that terrible of a game. It's still only a B tier, and they try to make up for it by basically apologizing to their customers, like, all right, well, we're gonna give you the next one. The next one's gonna be a banger. And the 5, this holds a nice place in my heart. I will always boot up my PS3, and this is the one that I will remember more than any other game that I booted up. even compared to its successor, because Gran Turismo 6 it's an A+ tier. I feel like Gran Turismo 6 was not as memorable as Gran Turismo 4. Not because it was a bad game, but because of its time of release. This is a game that basically came out at the dawn of the new generation of consoles. It was old news, and graphically speaking, that showed. And the fact that Polyphony Digital didn't make this a dual console game. They didn't make one for old gen and next gen like Grand Theft Auto did for their games, or many companies usually do that, they make a old gen and next gen. Because of that, I still think it's an A+ game, but it just misses shy of that S tier mark because of its time of release. Like I said, I'm grading these at time of release, and it just came at a bad time compared to other games. If you had the amount of money to buy this game at the time it launched, I wouldn't blame you for buying a different game, because obviously a new console came out. You probably didn't even want to buy this game because you're probably saving for the new console, and when you get the new console, you probably sold your old console, and this game wasn't available for the new console, so you just didn't really have a reason to play it. And finally, Gran Turismo Sport. Gran Turismo Sport is overall an S tier. This is a fantastic game, rounds off the series pretty well. Not quite an SS, but overall, I would still say it's very memorable, has many years of content, has a lot of cars, a lot of customization options, a lot of tracks, a lot of online play, but more importantly, a very good online community. You always have a few bad apples. People are less likely to do that in Gran Turismo Sport, and that's actually due to the fact that the game has inbuilt mechanics to punish people who drive like maniacs. The sound design in this game is also much better than any Gran Turismo game, period. There's an elephant in the room, but we're gonna talk about it where, God, their sound design sucks normally. Like, we're talking about GT6 and prior, you may as well just turn on your Dyson vacuum, because that's gonna sound better than the cars you hear in those games. Gran Turismo Sport though, you can finally dial up your speakers, put on your best set of headphones, and enjoy the beautiful cars. That was all that was missing from Gran Turismo's formula. So I'm glad this game brought it back, and I'm hoping the next Gran Turismo game will be once again another SS tier. So what's holding this game back from being SS tier? Well, it's because I'm a stupid hipster who has nostalgia overload, and at the end of the day, you just watch the entire video to hear some dumb idiot's personal opinion when you know damn well that you have your own personal opinion. But guess what? That's how the internet works. I still hate January. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more content about cars, and see y'all next time. Bladed Angel out.